Hello, this week we're going to be talking about power dynamics and diversity of gender and sexual expression for our beginning clinical skills and culturally responsive therapy course. By the end of this lecture, we'll be able to define power dynamics and diversity of gender and sexual expression, be able to name the key figures for power dynamics and diversity of gender and sexual expression, be able to discuss the clinical implications for and relevance of the concepts of power dynamics and diversity of gender and sexual expression. And we're going to start off talking about what are power dynamics. So just like the previous lectures that you've seen from me for these weeks, we're going to start off hearing directly from one of our key figures, Dr. Keltner, that we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, I want to be mindful up front. This is a snippet of him talking in his work, and um, it does not delve into concepts of power around like unequal power. It doesn't delve into like who has access to power. It's just a very, very simple snippet of power dynamics and him talking about it. And we will definitely talk about those other topics in relation to power dynamics as we go about this lecture.
So we're here on campus at UC
Yeah.
Berkeley, and I think in your book you talk about college dorm as an example of ideas of power and how
Yeah.
people. What can you talk to me about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that the science of power that I've been part of has taught us is we really have to, and anybody in their own life will recognize this, which is that we used to think of power as like, well, that's just politics or it's money or it's military action. But really, power is everywhere, right? Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, said that, you know, energy is the fundamental question in physics. It's about how objects relate to each other. And power is the fundamental question of social dynamics. All relationships have a dimension of power to them. And guided by that, you know, social scientists like myself have studied power dynamics in families, between parents and kids, you know, romantic partners. And then in my own lab, you know, we study who rises to power in dorms at Berkeley, and sororities, fraternities, basketball camps. And again, you know, what we do, and college dorms allow us to do this is they all come their first year, they're excited about being part of this dorm, they don't know each other, they come from different backgrounds, and then we can study who quickly gains the respect of their peers. And what we find is really interesting, and it replicates, for example, in financial advising firms, which is really quickly people fold into social hierarchies, right? You sort of meet people, you interact with them a bit, and you realize, like, this person's somebody I'd respect and I'd like to see in a leadership position. And then secondly, that kind of reputation you develop kind of moves through your social networks, you know, through casual conversations and gossip and things like that. So quickly, groups of different kinds kind of start to give power to certain kinds of individuals, the people who are good for the group.
So it's giving as opposed to getting.
Yeah, and again, you know, the science, and you know, science is good because it challenges our stereotypes and our cultural assumptions. And so there's this, you know, idea out in the broad culture of, well, you know, how you get power is you grab it, you know, and we love literature and dramas and television shows about power grabs, right? And we, you know, we think about, I've been watching Breaking Bad, and about, you know, how Walter White becomes this Machiavellian and he grabs power. Well, that's fiction. And more often, what you see in the organizations that make up our lives is groups kind of give power to certain individuals. And in fact, individuals who want to go out and grab power, right, in Machiavellian ways, quickly develop reputations as Machiavellians, and they become isolated in the activities of the group.
All right. So we heard a little bit from Dr. Keltner, and now we're going to talk about the definition of power dynamics. We're using a definition from Oxford Review, and that is that asymmetrical power relations encompass situations where power is unevenly distributed among different groups within a society or organization. This inequality often stems from factors such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or ability. In such scenarios, one group typically enjoys privileges and advantages, while another faces marginalization, discrimination, or oppression. So, talking about key figures, we just heard from one of them, but the first one we're going to talk about is Mikhail Foucault, who was born in 1926 in France and died in 1984 in France. He was the professor and chair of the history of systems of thought at the Collège de France, and he coined the concept of power knowledge, which is the idea that power and knowledge are inseparable. So we've all kind of heard the, you know, power, knowledge is power. So this came from Dr. Foucault. Um, he developed works across the 1970s, and he was the first scholar to systematically theorize how power operates through institutions, through discourse, and everyday social practices, rather than solely through force or law. He also had a foundational influence on critical theory, queer theory, disability studies, and post-colonial theories. So just was a very important person as we talk about some things that we've spent a lot of time talking about in this class that we're talking about culturally responsive therapy, right? And then who you just heard for was Dr. Keltner, who was born in 1962 in Templeton, California. He is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and is a founding faculty of and director of the Greater Good Science Center. He pioneered empirical research on how power changes behavior, demonstrating that holding power reduces empathy and increases self-serving behavior. And he also developed the concept of power as approach or inhibition, and that those with power become less attuned to others' emotions and needs, which is something we need to be really careful of as psychotherapists, because whether we want to or not, psychotherapists hold power in the room. And so we need to be constantly working to make sure that we are staying attuned to others' emotions and needs, especially those that we're working with. And then just as a little like fun thing, I thought he was actually a scientific advisor on the Pixar film Inside Out, advising on the science of emotion. Which we won't be talking as much about the science of emotion today, but I just thought it was kind of neat that he'd done that because I think that's an awesome movie. So I'm going to talk about clinical impacts. And what do power dynamics mean for you? If we're talking about self as a therapist, power is always present in the therapy room. That's something we need to remember. You hold institutional power as a licensed or pre-licensed clinician. And it's just a good idea to reflect on your own identities, your race, gender, class, ability, and how that shapes power dynamics with your clients. These are all things that we've been talking about today or this semester already. But we know that power imbalances can show up as overinterpreting client behavior through that dominant culture lens, pathologizing responses to systemic oppression. Those of you who are in my psychopathology course, we've been talking about this. Centering your own comfort over the client's experience. And then we need to make sure that we're getting like ongoing consultation and supervision to help identify our blind spots around those power and power dynamics. And then what do power dynamics mean for your clients? So when we're in clinical sessions, we need to be able to name power dynamics explicitly when it's appropriate. So kind of looking at, we've talked about socio-emotional relationship therapy and that idea of like naming the power dynamics. Clients from marginalized groups often just benefit from knowing that you know this or being able to talk about it out loud and not being afraid to bring it up to you. We need to be able to recognize how systems may be wielding power over our clients' lives. And we're like, oh, well, why don't you just do this? They may have a really good reason why they won't just do that. And those are things that we need to be aware of. We need to be curious about how power shows up in the client's relationships and communities. Who holds power in their family or community? Where do people feel like they have or do not have a voice? Where do they feel unheard or overlooked? We need to avoid replicating dominant culture power dynamics within the therapeutic relationship. We need to make sure that we are explicitly inviting clients to correct us to take the lead in defining their own experiences and letting us know when we get it wrong, and that we are not gonna, respond negatively to that. And then we have to follow through and not respond negatively to that when they correct us, and listen to them and learn from that. So that's our quick introduction to power dynamics. And now we're going to move on to our quick introduction to diversity of gender and sexual expression. So before we watch our videos, this is a little bit of a clunky term. This is what the week is called, so we're going to roll with it. But what we're really going to be talking about here is just like queerness, right? We're going to be talking about the fact that like queerness exists. So I just wanted to like say that out loud, because that affects some of the definitions we could call, and like some of what we could find on this topic. Because if you go Google diversity of gender and sexual expression as a term, that is not going to bring up very much, right? So what we're really talking about is queerness and queer expression. So we're going to start off with a very short snippet from Judith Butler. We're going to move on to a slightly longer video from another key figure, and we'll just dive right in.
If we look at the development of the gay, lesbian, bi, trans movement in the United States, the more cultural acceptance, the more cultural discourse, the more media presentation, the more proximity that people have to gay, lesbian, bi, trans people, the more that life becomes thinkable. It becomes a cultural possibility that one can consider because it's already in the world. You could say that the discourse of homosexuality, as it becomes more popular, makes it more possible for people to become gay or lesbian. My sense is that there's always something about desire and fantasy that's maybe partially unconscious or not fully realizable. Although certain kinds of cultural movements might make it possible to lead a lesbian or gay life, they don't determine that. They don't produce homosexuals.
Now, this is a really interesting clip, because if you go read the comments on it, there was some pushback on this idea, where people really seem to struggle with the idea that we don't create homosexuality, right? Like really struggle with the idea that like this is just innate to folks, and really push back on that idea that no, we absolutely can like make somebody homosexual, which is not what research is suggesting. Rather, research is suggesting it's similar to being left-handed. I always think about this one. My dad grew up in like a really rural space, and was left-handed, a really like rural Catholic space, and he used to get in a lot of trouble for being left-handed, and as a result, he really didn't want any of his kids to be left-handed. Um, and as a result, some of us who maybe actually are left-handed, but we're kind of taught out of it, do some weird things. Like my brother pitches left-handed, but writes right-handed, right? Stuff like that. That's just like, I wonder why that is. And what that is that there's still this genetic inherency about being left-handed, and it's the same like being research more and more is making it very clear that like our sexual, our gender, our relationship expression are not taught. Those are inherent pieces of us. And so I thought this was a good clip to include here, and also just to make sure we heard a little bit from Dr. Butler, because she's a very important figure when we're talking about queer theories and development. So, and then the other person we're going to hear from is Dr. Ian Toffey. I've been blessed and like very fortunate to get to like go to some of their workshops and some of their talks and stuff, and they're just really, really amazing. So I thought we would take a little bit to hear from them around gender.
Hello. So tonight I'm here to talk about how if we expand our idea of gender, maybe we can all feel a little bit freer. And yes, this is my calm down slide. And to begin with, I would invite you to take a breath, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. How do you know what gender you are? And can you describe your gender? Those are questions that might be really new to you, or those are questions that you might have heard 100 times. Either way, the reason why I'm asking you is because the overculture seems to have a really pretty good idea of what gender is. It's pink and blue, and it's girls and boys, and men and women, and we can see that in our toys, in our clothing, and in our restrooms. And this is a question that I'm deeply familiar with, that question of the gender binary, because I'm often asked, are you a boy or a girl? And my answer is yes. And that's me styling it in the 70s, and then in my own Italian version of The Breakfast Club in the 80s. So that question, are you a boy or a girl, is deeply rooted in an idea called gender essentialism, which is, if you're born with a vagina, you must be a woman with all that that entails, and if you're born with a penis, you must be a man with all that that entails, right? Well, tonight I'm gonna ask you to come through the kaleidoscope with me, and red pill or blue pill, you're just gonna go through it in a moment anyway. And we're gonna go into this vast gender landscape where there are so many explored and unexplored sites. And just like the Northern Lights are no less real and no less beautiful just because they're rare, so gender diversity and creativity have always existed all across the globe and all across time. For example, in the Roman Empire, because yes, I'm from Italy, there was a cult of the Frisian goddess Cybele, and her priestesses, called the Galli, were male assigned at birth and presented as feminine. And on this very land, which we now call the United States of America, gender diversity and creativity has always existed in indigenous tribes and in indigenous languages. This is Wiwa, a famous Zuni Two-Spirit person, and I invite you to check out the documentary Two Spirits to find out more about the current realities of Two Spirits people in the US. And so trans is but a small portion of that vast landscape. It's a kind of Anglo-based portion, and there are so many words all across the globe to describe this vast gender landscape. And here in the US in 2015, young people are really doing an amazing job of educating us about the gender landscape. I really encourage you to Google the gender unicorn and spend more than 5 minutes with this idea. Right? And even though Tumblr did not invent transgender people, yes, that is true, the internet has given us a really great platform. Here's Laverne Cox and Janet Mock, who have been doing an amazing job of bringing trans issues into mainstream media. So at this point, some of you might be sitting there thinking, what's this got to do with me? I mean, some of you probably have a pretty good idea, and some of you have not. And I'm here to propose to you tonight that you too may benefit from gender liberation. You no longer need to punch each task on your man card or on your woman card. You do not need to worry that if you have a penis and you do not know how to build a log cabin, you are not a man. Although if you know how to build one, I'm very excited. And when I talk about gender liberation, what I'm talking about is not doing away with masculinity and femininity and androgyny for everybody, although androgyny can be really awesome. Kate Winslet and Prince here as a proof. I am talking about dismantling cisgenderism, the idea that we have to be so rigid in the gender binary that we constrain ourselves, the way we present, the way we dress, what activities we can and cannot do. And Bridget Mandler, yes, I am the parent of a 12-year-old, sings about this in Postcard and talks about how that spark of authenticity dims when we say that some things are girls only or boys only. So please join me in dismantling cisgenderism and having a vision for collective liberation. What would happen if we stop policing our own and each other's gender identities, roles, and expression, like every day? And what would happen if we just stopped assuming someone's gender, stopped assuming their pronouns, stopped checking out which public restrooms they're walking into? And what would happen if we let our children tell us who they are, let them come into the world and grow into themselves and tell us about their gender identity? And yes, this is a very tall leap into possibility that I'm asking you to make. But if we can make that leap into the possibility that gender is so much broader than we think, then there is so much more room for all of us to swim in. Thank you.
All right. That was a little bit from Dr. Alex Iantofi. And we're going to move on to we're just going to use like a LGBTQ plus inclusion definition, also from the Oxford Review. LGBTQ plus inclusion refers to the intentional efforts and practices that ensure people of all sexual orientations and gender identities feel welcome, supported, and represented in all areas of society, particularly within organizations and institutions. It involves removing barriers to participation, addressing discrimination, and affirming the rights and dignity of LGBTQ plus individuals. This inclusion extends beyond policy statements and requires an embedded culture of respect, education, and allyship. It demands active listening, structural change, and equitable representation. We're going to move on to our key figures, both of whom we've already heard from. So Dr. Judith Butler was born in 1956 in Cleveland, Ohio, is professor emerita of comparative literature and critical theory at UC Berkeley, developed the theory of gender performativity, the argument that gender is not an innate identity, but a repeated set of social performances introduced in gendered trouble. And I want to be really, really careful that we're not misconstruing that to mean that like what your gender is or how you represent your gender is not inherent or innate, but just that like the performative identity of it is not innate. And then is a recipient of the 2012 Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt and co-founded the academic journal Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies. And then Dr. Alex Iantofi is born in Italy. I am not sure when. I saw one reference maybe to 1971, so I'm not positive that's the correct birth date. They're a licensed marriage and family therapist, clinical supervisor, and author based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They developed significant contributions to gender affirming and trauma informed therapeutic practice, particularly with transgender, non binary, and gender expansive clients. They've co authored How to Understand Your Gender, Genderqueer, and Genderqueer with Meg Barker, as well as Life Isn't Binary. And you'll, if you're in the sex therapy courses, you might recognize Meg John Barker as the author of one of our main books for a couple of those classes. And then they're faculty at various clinical training programs, bringing intersectional and systemic frameworks to therapist education, which is what you're doing right now. And if we talk about clinical impacts, what does diversity of gender and sexual expression mean for you? So if we go back to Self of the Therapist, and we examine our own assumptions about gender and sexuality, we need to examine our own assumptions about gender and sexuality, including those shaped by your upbringing, culture, and training. We need to recognize that affirming care is not optional. It's an ethical responsibility for us as clinicians. We need to understand the difference between gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and romantic orientation. We need to use the correct names and pronouns. We need to repair quickly without over dramatizing when you make mistakes. And we need to seek out training on affirming practices for LGBTQ plus clients. I want to especially highlight the second to last one, this idea that like we need to repair quickly without over dramatizing. You will mess this up. I mess this up. Sometimes I forget folks' pronouns. Sometimes I just get them wrong. Sometimes I just have a brain fart. And the way we handle that is we just immediately correct ourselves. If we can't remember the correct pronoun, we just ask for it and then correct ourselves and go on. You do it very quickly. You do it very matter of fact, so that it is not made a big deal for the person, and so that it is also very, very obvious that like that is an important thing and that you will make the effort and will continue to get their names and pronouns correct. And then in clinical sessions, we need to not assume. So we're talking about what does diversity of gender and sexual expression mean for our clients. In clinical sessions, we need to not assume gender or sexual orientation. We need to let clients self-define. It's a really, really good idea. If you can, I know some of you will be at institutions where you don't have a lot to say over this. If you can, though, it's really a good idea to have this on intake paper. It makes it so much easier to just have some questions on intake paper around pronouns, around gender, around what name they'd like to go by, and like how they would like to be identified and discussed. We should be asking open-ended questions. How do you identify? How would you like me to refer to you? We should also be checking in on this kind of regularly, or at least letting them know, like, hey, I know that like gender can be fluid. I know that identity can be fluid. Definitely let me know if your name ever changes. Let me know if your pronouns ever change. I'm happy to change those. If you notice as you're talking to them, that they're using different pronouns for themselves, sometimes I'll just check in and be like, hey, I just want to check in real quick. I noticed that like you had been using they them pronouns and you're using she her pronouns today. Do you want me, and when I write up the note for this session, do you want me to use she her pronouns? Do you want me to use they them? Do you want me to use both? Would you like me just to not and just say the client and find a way around pronouns? Whatever that looks like, right? But letting them know that like you care about that, you care about their comfort and their identity, and she'll go the extra step for that. Um, Asking open-ended questions about how does your gender or sexuality show up and what brought you to therapy, and being able to take the answer that maybe it doesn't, right? Like maybe there's no connection, and that's fine, and we're just going to work on what brought them to therapy. And then how are your gender and sexuality received in your family and community, so that you know that when you're helping to support them through different experiences and events. Be aware that many LGBTQ plus clients have experienced harm from prior therapists or healthcare providers. I think the most recent, hmm, I think the most recent numbers, I may be getting this wrong, but I don't think I am. I think a fourth of LGBTQ clients or folks have put off care because they're worried about discrimination. And I think that increases to a third for specifically trans clients. And then I think a third of queer clients have experienced either like had negative interactions or experienced like discrimination from a previous mental health care worker. And that increases to half when we're talking about specifically trans folks. So the folks that walk into your room will absolutely have had these experiences, and we want to be aware of that and make sure that we are not adding to them. Um, and then we want to create the visibly affirming therapeutic space. We should not have stuff in it that signals they are not safe. And then understanding that minority stress, stigma, discrimination, concealment is a significant clinical concern for LGBTQ plus clients and is something they absolutely experience. And I would love to have a conversation with that, but I also heavily encourage you, if you're really interested in working with queer folks in therapy, definitely check out the gender and context course. And that goes much farther into this. And of course, there is the gender affirming clinical care certificate program that you can look at as well. If you're not, already doing one of the other certificate programs, or planning to take other classes during your elective periods for this program. And then some takeaway considerations. It's just a reminder that power is not neutral. It shapes every therapeutic encounter, from diagnosis to treatment planning to the dynamic you have even between the two of you. And it doesn't matter if you want to have that power or not, you have it. So you have to be responsible for it. Understanding how power, we need to understand how power operates, both structurally and interpersonally, and that doing so helps us avoid replicating those same sorts of harms our clients have probably already experienced. And then similarly, understanding that diversity in gender and sexual expression is a fundamental part of human experience, and that affirming care requires us to continually examine our assumptions and to center each client's self-understanding individually. And then I would love for you to go take a look. I've just included some TED Talks that I think are great on these subjects. That if you would like some extra information beyond what you get from this module, and from the other work that you're going to be doing during this module, to just go ahead and take a look at these TED Talks whenever you have a moment. Let me know if you have questions, and I think you'll still be seeing me for a couple more of these little week check-ins.